because fiction is the abstraction of hierarchies of attentional prioritization and action. And so we can say that in the highest sense, in the biblical corpus, God is the ultimate fictional character.
Ding, ding, ding.
Alex, you figured it out, man.
He's just described God as a fictional character whose existence is simply a characterization of value made by the human mind for the purpose of uniting us psychologically and socially. This is exactly what atheists say. God does not exist except as he is invented by the human mind. And
this is so yes, Alex. Yes, bro.
The reason why the human mind invents God is to provide some psychological and social stability. If this is not atheism, then what is?
Yeah.
So, Dr. Peterson, do you think that the events of Exodus actually happened, or are they just fiction?
You might ask, well, did the events in Exodus really happen? And our conclusion was, well, not only did they happened in a meta manner, they're still happening.
Okay.
They happened they happened with such reality that they haven't stopped happening.
Why can he not say the same thing about Cain and Abel, or about Exodus? I mean, just compare these two responses.
When I read something like a novel by Dostoevsky, I think, well, is this true? And the answer is, well, those precise events never happened.
It's easy for his brain, we've seen this with him engaging with Sam Harris, to not be defensive or apologetic for anything outside of the Bible.
When I look at a story like Cain and Abel, I think, well, the question, did that happen, begs the question, what do you mean by happen? Because when you are dealing with...
You see what's going on? He cannot just be consistent. I caught this nugget of Alex O'Connor deconstructing Jordan Peterson. Look, we've been picking Jordan Peterson apart lately. He has such a Jungian metaphysical, symbolism, story, mythological view. But when he's asked the tough historical questions, he never really addresses them and answers them. And so I'm listening to Alex O'Connor deconstruct Jordan Peterson with you. Let's see what he has to say.
For a man who titled the 10th chapter of his 12 Rules for Life, Be Precise in Your Speech, Jordan Peterson seems ludicrously uninterested in his own advice anytime he's speaking on the topic of religion.
We found that out in other series and videos, and he still does this.
Or belief in God. Now, granted, these aren't exactly the most straightforward areas of study known to man, so I wouldn't expect his views to be without detail and clarification. But in my view, Peterson tends to needlessly overcomplicate any question he has ever asked about God or religion to an extent that borders on the comic.
So people say to me, do you believe in God? And I think, okay, there's a couple of mysteries in that question. What do you mean do? What do you mean you? What do you mean believe? And what do you mean God? And you say as the questioner, well, we already know what all those things mean except belief in God. And I think, no, if we're going to get down to the fundamental brass tacks, we don't really know what any of those things mean.
So I want to take a moment to explain why, after having listened carefully to a great deal of his recent material on religion, and even going to see him talk about it in person, my takeaway is this. Jordan Peterson is what most people would call an atheist. He thinks that God is a fictional character, that the stories of religious scripture did not literally occur, and that the idea of God and stories about him are primarily a way for people to ground their value structures and provide social and psychological unity. Now,
I think that Alex is correct in assessing that.
I do realize that Dr. Peterson himself would probably not be best pleased with that characterization I've just given of him as an atheist, so allow me to take some time to defend that claim. Fair warning, it's going to get a bit wordy and complicated, but stick with me.
Well, you say what you mean and mean what you say, though, Alex. That's what matters.
I might be wrong, but I've tried my best to offer an account of what it is that Jordan Peterson actually thinks, before then offering some criticism. Of course, if I do get it wrong, then, Dr. Peterson, you're always welcome on my podcast. To begin with, we have to start with...
He's like, please.
a fundamental question. To Jordan Peterson, real or not, what is God? To begin answering this, we need to understand Peterson's views about value. For Jordan Peterson, our ability to do just about anything requires a belief in some set of value judgments. For example, even being able to do something as simple as looking at this glass, simply seeing a cup, requires the assumption of value judgments. And there are two reasons for this. The first is expressed here by Jonathan Pageau, who appears to have had a huge impact on Peterson's thinking.
We can't perceive an is without a hierarchy of attention and without a hierarchy of perception, because the world is is indefinite in detail and in quantity. And so for even to be able to say this, to point to something, to say that, is already in this hierarchy of something we could call vertical causation.
So first, there are a near infinite number of ways that we can see the world. We could look in all different directions, focus on multiple things. We can see things as parts or as wholes. And so to focus on one object at first requires an attention hierarchy.
The hierarchy of attention.
What's worth looking at? What do we value focusing on? But it goes even deeper. For Peterson, the very ability to even identify a cup as a distinguishable object requires a belief in certain values. If I put this cup on a table, why do I still see the cup and the table as two distinct objects? Why don't I perceive them as one big, weirdly shaped object? And why don't I see this cup as multiple objects? The side, the bottom, the rim. Why do I see it as one unified object when there are so many different ways that we could look at it? Well, here's what Dr. Peterson has to say.
If you were a photorealist painter, you could spend a month painting all the reflections on that glass. It's a very complex thing to perceive, but you perceive it as a unity. And we know this neuropsychologically. We know this scientifically. You perceive it as a unity because you can grip it, and because you can raise it to your lips, and because you can drink it, and because you need to drink water to survive. And you are willing to drink water to survive because you believe emotionally and motivationally and perhaps rationally that survival is a good. And that's dependent on your belief that human existence in some sense is a good.
Do you really need to believe that, or is that just kind of intrinsic to all of us naturally to want to survive?
And that it's striving towards some sort of higher unified order. And you might think, well, you don't need all that to perceive the glass. And the answer is, yeah, as a matter of fact, you need all of that to perceive the glass.
So the reason my brain perceives this cup as a single object is functional. It's because I can use this cup to drink things. And the reason I see it like that is because I want to drink things, because drinking things is necessary to my survival. And so I must, in some sense, value my survival in order to see the cup. So in order to perceive the world around us, according to Peterson, and objects within it, we need to believe in a hierarchy of values. But we don't just need to believe in this value hierarchy to see anything. We also need it in order to do anything. Here, Peterson gives the example of writing an essay.
I used to ask my students, why are you writing this essay? And that's a variation of the question, why do anything? But let's make it concrete. Why are you writing this essay? Well, so that I can get a grade for the class. Why are you taking the class? So that I can finish my year at university. Why are you finishing your year at university and motivated to do that? To get my degree. Why do you want the degree? And then that's a whole hierarchy of value that is definitely governing either in an integrated manner or a disintegrated manner the actions of the person who's writing the essay.
So this is a little bit more straightforward. Whenever we do anything, someone can ask, why are you doing that? Why am I making this video right now? Well, so I can share my views with you. And why do I want to share my views with you? Or to contribute to a meaningful conversation. Well, why do I want to do that? Because I value such meaning, and so on and so forth. And this can go on up this hierarchy of things that I value until we get to the very top, the thing that we value most of all, upon which everything else is predicated. Okay, so in order to see anything or do anything, we must be motivated by some hierarchy of values. So here's an important question. What is at the top of that value hierarchy? What is the fundamental value upon which everything else is based? Here's where it gets really interesting.
And you might say, well, how hard are you going to try when you write this essay? And the answer to that would be, well, it depends on how well integrated my view of the ethic is all the way up to the highest place. And then we could say, well, the highest place is the divine place, and we could make that a matter of definition.
There it is. Did you catch that? It was so quick that you'd miss it if you blinked. But Jordan Peterson just told us what God is in his view. Listen again.
And then we could say, well, the highest place is the divine place, and we could make that a matter of definition.
The highest place, that is the highest place on this value hierarchy that we were just talking about, is the divine place. And we can make that a matter of definition.
This is so important. If you ever listen to Jordan Peterson, you can kind of get, if you listen to what's being said right now by Alex, you'll in the future discussions or debates or whatever he has that we react to, we have to keep this in mind.
Wow. The word divine, of course, means of or relating to God. And Peterson has just told us that for him, it's a simple matter of definition that the divine is just whatever value is at the highest place on the value hierarchy. So let's go back to that essay that we were talking about. Writing the essay requires a value hierarchy. Why are you writing the essay? To get a good grade. Why do you want the good grade? To get a good job. Why do you want the job? And so on and so forth, up the value hierarchy. Peterson says that we can simply take as a matter of definition that wherever we end up when we follow this hierarchy, whatever happens to be at the highest place is the divine. So what is the nature of this thing at the top of the value hierarchy? What takes up this divine place? How do we characterize it? Peterson's answer here is astonishing.
And so then we might say, well, what should be in the divine place? And I would say, well, it has to be something that you can look at the world through, and it has to be something you act out. And then we can say, well, that still leaves residual mystery. And then we might ask, well, how do we characterize it? And I would say we characterize that using fiction, because fiction is the abstraction of hierarchies of attentional prioritization and action. And so we can say that in highest sense, in the biblical corpus, God is the ultimate fictional character.
Ding, ding, ding.
Alex, you figured it out, man. No, now it makes sense why he is so against anyone asking, did this happen about Bible? And it's really, really odd watching that behavior happen. But again, Alex, you're hitting something very, very important here, man.
One more time, please.
We can say that in highest sense, in the biblical corpus, God is the ultimate fictional character.
God is a fictional character. God is the fictional personification of the highest value held by human beings. Let's break down how...
That's so Jungian and like definitely like Joseph Campbell-y and stuff like that. And the reason why I think there's something to that is reading the Alcoholics Anonymous book by Dr. Bob, and there's Bill and Bob, the original guys of the 12-step program. One of them knew someone who had a lot of money, and I can't remember who exactly it was, but they went and literally, I think it was Carl Jung, I believe, or one of these psychiatrists at the time. Psychologist, not 100% sure. But they pretty much said that it takes a divine intervention for an alcoholic to get sober, right? So in some way, there's divine and psychology intertwined. And at the 12-step meetings, they say a God of your own understanding that you place in that hierarchy, so to speak, at the top, that you aspire to, something greater than yourself.
We got to where we are. Human beings simply find themselves unable to function without values. That's where we started. To see things or do things, we need to value things. Whatever the fundamental value is at the top of the value hierarchy is, for Peterson, by definition, divine. And God is just the fictional personification of these values. And then Peterson adds just one more thing.
God is the ultimate fictional character. And then we're trying to characterize his nature as that which should be emulated, that unites us psychologically and socially.
So, in my view, this is the proof. Jordan Peterson is an atheist. He's just described God as a fictional character whose existence is simply a characterization of value made by the human mind for the purpose of uniting us psychologically and socially. This is exactly what atheists say. God does not exist except as he is invented by the human mind. And
this is so yes, Alex. Yes, bro.
The reason why the human mind invents God is to provide some psychological and social stability. If this is not atheism, then what is? So now we can understand that when Peterson...
Probably why Peterson says no one is an atheist. In his own definition, he may not think this is atheism, and therefore what he is, which we would say makes perfect sense from the atheist perception about God as a human construct within our social and also imaginative conceptions, that he doesn't see anyone as an atheist because everyone has hierarchies. So his definition of God, and that somehow he believes is literally the case, which I would have questions about. How far does one really reach that hierarchy? Like, do we ever ultimately have a chief, highest thing? Or are we not thinking of the closest things that matter right now? Like, okay, I have a family I need to provide for, so I'm going to do this to make money, to make sure they're taken care of. And then, you're not like usually thinking on the grand celestial highest possible value system in order to make sense of the right now in front of me things that I'm trying to solve. But that's a whole different thing. Maybe Alex gets into that.
And talks about God, what he's really talking about is something like the fundamental value that human beings hold, whatever is at the top of their value hierarchy. Now we can actually begin to make sense of a lot of the things that Peterson has said in the past that seem bewildering upon first hearing.
Right.
For example, listen to this clip from a recent Lex Friedman podcast, bearing in mind that Peterson uses the word secular here to mean something like non-religious.
Even secular people go to museums. I'm secular. Well, are you in a museum? Yes. Are you looking at art? Yes. Well, what makes you think you're secular then?
Hold on. What? The fact that you're in a museum looking at art means that you're not secular? Why on earth would somebody have to be religious to look at art? Well, if by God and divinity, Peterson is simply referring to fundamental human value, then since to enjoy art requires some sense of valuing art or beauty, then of course you can't be secular and enjoy art. The problem, of course, is that this simply isn't what most people mean by God or divine or secular. Christians are generally asked to believe in God, not as some fictional representative value judgment,
Right.
but as a real entity existing independently of the human mind who really came to earth as a human and was really crucified by the Romans as a historical fact. If Peterson thinks that God is a fictional character and that these stories contained in scripture are fictional in nature, then he is simply, in almost anybody else's terminology, an atheist. So, does Peterson think that the events of the Bible are fictional, or does he think that they really happened? Well, let's take a listen.
Let's take a listen. This gets good.
The Old Testament reports in the book of Exodus that the Jews were enslaved in Egypt before embarking on a journey through the wilderness after being liberated from their slavery. Moses is said to part the Red Sea during the escape, which he then drops on the Pharaoh and his soldiers, drowning all of them and facilitating the Jewish escape. Quite a specific series of events.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Peterson, do you think that the events of Exodus actually happened, or are they just fiction?
You might ask, well, did the events in Exodus really happen? And our conclusion was, well, not only did they happened in a meta manner, they're still happening.
Okay.
They happened they happened with such reality that they haven't stopped happening. And what does that mean? Well, everyone still struggles with the spirit of tyranny. And everyone still struggles with the fact that when you escape from a tyranny, you don't hit the promised land, you hit the desert. And then when you're in the desert of your imagination or with your lost peers, then you need to struggle with what guides you and what should guide you when you're lost.
Okay, so I have so many bones to pick with this that I think are important. But just to fundamentally say, I really wish that Jordan explained his methodology when he approaches Bible, understanding that most people do not read this way, and that he is expressing why he thinks this interpretive model makes better sense of the text. It's almost like he's afraid of showing his cards on saying, hey, when we approach this material, we're not taking this as bona fide, literal, photo, this is what happened, history. We need to understand this as a living document that has value and story and lessons. And in effect, he does that, but most people are left bewildered, not really getting what he's trying to do here. Maybe when they take his courses, they go through 18 lectures and finally figure out, like, okay, hold on, now I get what he's doing, but I don't really know.
And then you have to grapple with the problem of appropriate and reliable forms of governance, because that's all part of the Exodus story. And so it didn't happen the way a happening would occur if you just detailed it out as a camera holding empirical observer. It happened in a way deeper way that just doesn't stop happening.
So when asked, did the Exodus really happen? Peterson says, it's still happening. What? The Jews are still wandering in the desert? Moses is still moseying around and parting seas? Look, I get what Peterson is saying. The story of Exodus describes a struggle with tyranny and the aftermath of liberation, and these are themes that are still relevant and true today. But Peterson is smart enough to know that he's being asked a simple historical question. Did the events historically occur? Regardless of how true the message is today, did the events described actually happen? And for some inexplicable reason, rather than simply saying, well, the Exodus didn't actually happen, it's a fictional story, but it contains themes that are universally true about human nature, Peterson refers to it as a meta-truth.
They happened in a meta manner.
And claims that it's still actually happening today.
They're still happening.
And I haven't just cherry-picked a bad example of Peterson failing to properly explain his views. This keeps happening. Here's another example, this time on the story of Cain and Abel from the book of Genesis, this time taken from a recent podcast that Peterson conducted with my good friend Mohammed Hijab.
I did a lecture last night at the Apollo on the story of Cain and Abel. Yes. And one of the things that I proposed was that not only did that story happen, but it's always happening. Yes. It always happened. It's happening right now, and it's always going to happen into the future. And so I would say to some degree, the mere reduction of these profound stories to a historical reality is an underestimate of their truth, because they're a strange kind of truth, because they're the truth that always happened and is happening now and always will happen. So the Cain and Abel story, for example, you have a story of the eternal battle between something like the spirit of joyful and appropriate sacrifice, which is characterizes Abel, and the spirit of resentful resentment against the structure of existence as a consequence of thrownness and the shaking of the fist at God. And that's always happening.
Once again, Peterson is simply describing good fiction. Did the events occur? No. But the story describes truths about human nature that have always been true.
It's that simple, okay? This is why you can get wisdom from the Bible, from the stories, and yet say, yeah, but that never happened. That literally never happened. But you can say elements of this do happen in history. Things like this happen. Now, the miracle parts, I mean, clearly you got to understand how many people are naive or gullibly indoctrinated to believe this literally happened, and how much are you setting them up for failure when they come to find out that ancient fiction was common with miraculous tropes?
That's literally what this reduces to. I mean, imagine if someone were to ask me, did the Battle of Hogwarts really happen? Like, was it a historical event? And I said, it happened with such reality that it's still happening. Because the importance of sacrificing our safety to protect good against evil, and the notion that, like, evil is always pressing up against the walls of our castle, man, that's a deeper truth than calling it mere fiction can capture.
Come on.
I would sound like an idiot. And this is my utter confusion with Jordan Peterson. Why is he so hesitant to answer the question that everybody wants to know? Do you think these events actually took place? Did a man literally rise from the dead as a historical fact? Did the Jews, once enslaved in Egypt, travel to the Promised Land through the wilderness? And since Peterson sees these stories as fictional, meta-truths,
In a meta manner.
the answer is clearly no. Sure, the ideas contained within the stories are real and pertain to the ongoing human condition. Okay, that doesn't make the events meta-true. It just makes them, like any other story of ahistorical events that yet speak to an important aspect of human experience, fiction. This is something that Douglas Murray actually points out to Jordan Peterson, comparing religious stories with the stories of the novelist Dostoevsky.
Dostoevsky, obviously, if you say is Dostoevsky true, you need to say in what sense. But then, I mean, the issue with the Bible, the issue with Christianity, the issue with faith is that it's obviously different. It must be in a different realm. It's clearly in a different realm because it claims different things for itself. Dostoevsky doesn't demand that we believe that Raskolnikov lived. The Bible, if you're going to be a believer, you have to be able to say, in the words of the creed, that you believe in the virgin birth, that you believe, most importantly, in the resurrection.
This is why it's deceptive. What Jordan does is deceptive.
And as you well know, Jordan, many of us can walk 99% of the way there in terms of belief in the truth of the story, or as Betjeman puts it, but is it true? Is it true? And then stumble on the last thing.
Quite right. And listen to what Peterson has to say about Dostoevsky.
When I read something like a novel by Dostoevsky, I think, well, is this true? And the answer is, well, those precise events never happened. So on that basis, it's not true. But then there's something wrong with that description, because the characterizations in Dostoevsky are so true that in some sense they've never been surpassed.
See? How hard was that? Those precise events never happened, but the characterizations are deeply true. Why can he not say the same thing about Cain and Abel or about Exodus? I mean, just compare these two responses.
When I read something like a novel by Dostoevsky, I think, well, is this true? And the answer is, well, those precise events never happened.
It's easy for his brain, we've seen this with him engaging with Sam Harris, to not be defensive or apologetic for anything outside of the Bible.
When I look at a story like Cain and Abel, I think, well, the question, did that happen, begs the question, what do you mean by happen? Because when you are dealing with...
You see what's going on? He cannot just be consistent.
Fundamental realities, and you pose a question, you have to understand that the reality of the concepts of your question, when you're digging that deep, are just as questionable as what you're questioning.
For some reason, when the fictional story in question is a scriptural story, Peterson becomes unable to describe it as fiction in the way that he would describe literally any other meaningful but ahistorical story as fiction. Indeed, he appears to become unable to string a meaningful sentence together at all when he's talking about this stuff. If the Exodus is still happening, then on the same justification that Peterson gives, Raskolnikov murdering Alyona Ivanovna is still happening too. But that would be a ridiculous characterization of what fiction is. And so if somebody asked me if the events of Crime and Punishment actually happened, I'd simply say no. Okay, next, I want to give you a specific example of something which I think demonstrates how Jordan Peterson uses language in a deliberately vague and elusive manner to support his strange claims about belief in God. The specific example I'm going to give here is an incredibly bold claim made by Peterson in both his podcast with Jonathan Pageau and with Lex Friedman. Peterson claims in these clips that a prerequisite for being a scientist is having some kind of transcendent and deistic, that is, relating to a deity, a god, assumptions. Here it is in his own words.
And then I was thinking, well, what's the precondition for being a scientist? And I thought, well, in some sense, it's a there's deistic preconditions, because one of the things that characterizes scientists, and this includes people like Dawkins, who's a real scientist, is that the scientist presumes axiomatically that there's a transcendent realm outside the domain of epistemological theory.
Okay, so why is it then that to be a scientist, you have to presuppose the existence of some transcendent reality that is deistic in nature? Well, let's listen to him explaining this to Lex Friedman.
Do you believe in the transcendent if you're a scientist? And the answer is, well, not only do you believe in it, you believe in it more than anything else, because if you're a scientist, you believe in what objects to your theory more than you believe in your theory. Now, we got to think that through very carefully. So your theory describes the world, and as far as you're concerned, your description of the world is the world. But because you're a scientist, you think, well, even though that's my description of the world and that's what I believe, there's something beyond what I believe. And that's the object. And so I'm going to throw my theory against the object and see where it'll break.
Okay, so Peterson has just described the process of scientific inquiry, and he makes an important point, which is that scientists spend more time trying to disprove their theories than really trying to prove them, or at least they try to prove them by failure to disprove them. Science usually involves testing a hypothesis against things that might disprove that hypothesis, so that if something does, we can adapt the theory. A quite straightforward observation. But listen to how Peterson characterizes it.
And so I'm going to throw my theory against the object and see where it'll break. And then I'm going to use the evidence of the break as a source of new information to revitalize my theory. So as a scientist, you have to posit the existence of the ontological transcendent before you can move forward at all.
Whoa, hold on. All a scientist needs to posit to do science is the existence of truths that we currently don't know about. We have a theory or set of theories, but there are lots of true things about the world that aren't encompassed by our theories.
Right.
So we have to take our theory and test it against this unknown world to learn new things. But Peterson opts to describe this unknown world as the ontological transcendent.
So
He does this all the time. Look, ladies and gentlemen, we will continue this reaction with Alex O'Connor deconstructing Jordan Peterson. What did you take away from this video? Be sure to subscribe. Go check out Alex's channel, but subscribe to this one and hit that bell so you're notified every time we react. Like the video, drop a comment so the YouTube gods are paying attention. The ontological, truer than true, meta truth, YouTube deities are paying attention to the channel. Share this bad boy out, and until next time, see you then.